Let's create an IAM role in AWS. Aside from IAM users and groups, we could also create an IAM role in AWS. This role could be attached with certain or specific permissions, but you might wonder what's the difference between having a standard account or a user account and a role. A role is intended to be assumable. For a simple example, EC2 instance itself can assume a role. Let's say that role has an attached S3 access permissions. So without supplying any additional credentials, the EC2 could access those buckets or folders and objects that the corresponding policy that is attached to the role is allowing it to. Let us go through first what has been set up. So under EC2, so we have our instance. So the name is my first EC2 instance. As you could see, it has the public IP address and the private IPv4 address. It's running and it's ready for us to connect. So by clicking this instance, and if we go to actions, security, and modify IAM role, as you could see, we don't have any IAM role attached to this instance. Next, let's go to S3 and we type S3 under services. So S3, and let's wait for it to load. So you could see that we have one general purpose bucket. So the name is my first S3 bucket dash testing. And if we click on it, it has two folders. So my first folder and my second folder. So we have this bucket, and inside the bucket we have two folders. We are back at the EC2, the list of our instances. So I click back to our my first EC2 instance. You notice there's a connect here. So let's click connect. So there are possible options for us to connect our instance, and let's take a look at the session manager. So when clicking on the session manager, it tells us that we cannot connect on our instance because this session manager, systems manager, requires an IAM instance profile, which in our case we don't have yet for our instance. Let's attempt to fix this issue so as we can connect to our instance. So by doing that, we need to go to IAM or Identity and Access Management. So you could simply type IAM here. Okay, so there is another one which is IAM Identity Center. That will be for our future videos, but for now, let's select this IAM. Wait for it for load, and you can see the dashboard is telling us some recommendations, but our focus is not the security recommendations, but here the roles, and we will create our very first role that is intended to be used by our EC2. We could create our first role by clicking this. So create role, so IAM, then we go to roles, then clicking this create role button. So it should give us some steps. Step 1, select trusted identity. Step 2, permissions and the name, and to review, and finally create our role. First in the steps in creating a role is selecting a trusted identity. So if we go back to the reason why we are creating this role is for our EC2. So there are some options here. So AWS service, AWS account, web identity, and so on and so forth. But for us, we will make use of this role to the EC2 service. So we will select the first one, AWS service. So service or use case, we could search EC2, and we have some options here, but we will just select this one. EC2, and the use case again is selected is EC2, and we could click next. Next step is adding permissions. Of course, I could search and find the appropriate permission that we will assign to our role or provide or give to our role. But for now, for clarity purposes, I will click next first, and let's just focus on creating the role. So I will not add permission policies yet for this, and let's just click next. Finally, we reach step 3, which is to name our role, to review, and finally create. So first is the role name. So let's have my first EC2 role. Okay, so we have the description of this, and we have the trust policy. So of course, let's just leave it as it is. We don't have any lessons yet on reading a JSON statement and the trust policies. So next is adding permission. So later on we'll add permission, add tags. Of course we can add tags here, but we can skip first. So far we just added or give a role name, then we create the role. So the role, my first EC2 role is created. So let's click view role, and as you can see, it doesn't have any permissions yet. So we will attach or assign a permission on this. So we could edit this role and add more permissions. So add permissions. But before we add the permission for that role that we have created, so I would like to review us on our intention to create a role, which is for us to connect to the EC2 instance via the session manager of the systems manager. And we have this policy, an AWS managed policy, Amazon SSM Managed Instance core, that allows EC2 to enable AWS System Manager Service Core functionality. We are back with our my first EC2 role, and let's add permission and attach policy. So we have already an AWS managed policy for SSM, so let's just search for that one. So we could search SSM, and let us wait for the AWS to filter. Okay, so then let's find that one. So we are looking for Amazon SSM Managed Instance core. So if we could read the policy for Amazon EC2 role to enable, so we have already read that in the document. So we check on this policy, an AWS managed policy, and click add permissions. Now we could see the Amazon SSM Managed Instance core permission policy added to our role. So therefore, we could now make use of this EC2 role. And remember, we go to our EC2 and check on the IAM role, and we don't have any value. So we will go back to our EC2 instance, go to the same steps in order to modify the IAM role, and add or select this my first EC2 role. So we are back in our EC2 instances. So we select our my first EC2 instance. We go back to actions, go to security, and we click on modify IAM role. And this time we already have created our first IAM role intended for this EC2. So let's just find it. So we select this my first EC2 role, and finally update the IAM role. After I modify the IAM role, I waited for I think 10 plus minutes and go back to the connect to instance. I would still see that under the session manager, I able to connect to the instance. Based from the AWS Systems Manager user guide from its documentation. So you see here, if you change the IAM instance profile, it might take some time for the instance credentials to refresh. The SSM agent won't process requests until this happens. So to speed up the refresh process, you can restart the SSM agent, which we don't have yet for our EC2, or restart the instance or restart the EC2 instance. So let me go ahead and reboot the EC2 instance. Of course, if this is a production instance, so you need to have some approvals or requests, or you need to do it on a maintenance window, you cannot simply reboot a production instance. Then again, this is just a testing or a demonstration instance, so we could reboot as to how we need it to be. So we click on the instance and reboot the instance. Now the instance is rebooted and we can attempt again. So let's select the my first EC2 instance, click connect and select the session manager, and as you could see, we don't have the error already that we need some IAM instance profile. We now have the connect button, and let's try to click connect, and this will launch the session manager. And yes, we are able to go inside our EC2 instance. Inside our EC2 instance, so we could also verify on what the IAM profile it assumed. So we could make use of the AWS command, but first we could check whether AWS CLI is installed by typing this command AWS version, and yes, our AWS CLI is installed. Let's clear this first, and we could type AWS SDS get color dash identity. So enter, and we could see from the ARN that the assumed role is the my first EC2 role. So remember, we have some S3 buckets and folders or objects inside it. So we could make use of this command AWS space S3 space LS to list your buckets, folders, or objects. Let's test it on our EC2 instance. So AWS S3 LS. So it should list the buckets, folders, or objects, provided that our EC2 instance has the permission to that corresponding bucket. So let's try, and you could see an error occurred. Access is denied when calling the list buckets operation. Access is denied. Let's fix that issue by going back to our IAM role, my first EC2 role. And remember, we only have one permission policy assigned to this, which is the Amazon SSM Managed Instance core. So it doesn't have any S3 permission policy attached or added to this role. So that is why the EC2 don't have any permission, for example listing the buckets and folders or objects as we have seen just now. So let's add the permission. So click on add permission, attach policies, and we would search for S3. So again, this is for demonstration purposes only. So by right, we should be creating a customer managed policy and not providing, for example, the Amazon S3 full access. In later videos, we will show on how to specify the appropriate bucket that we could, or this EC2 could access only. But for now, the intention of this video demonstration is on the IAM role and how to attach specific permissions on the IAM role. So for now, we will attach this Amazon S3 full access and we click on add permissions. We have updated our IAM role and successfully attached Amazon S3 full access to this my first EC2 role. So we could now test our EC2 if it will still have this access denied permission, or by adding now the policy or the permission policy Amazon S3 full access, would our EC2 will be able to successfully list the buckets. So we could type in again or up arrow, so AWS S3 LS, and hit enter. And now you could see that there is no error occurred or access is denied, but this time it returned the bucket name, which is my first S3 bucket dash testing. So we could further go in, for example, AWS S3 LS, and we type S3 colon // then the name of the bucket, so my first S3 bucket testing, and hit enter. So it should return the two folders that were created. So we have my first folder and my second folder.